did we say earlier? We get the ball rolling or something like that? All right, we're going to get it rolling today. Preparing to Meet the Redeemer. The title message today. In the best-selling book, The Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom tells of the tense times in Holland during the German invasion. One particular night, she tossed restlessly in her bed while warplanes growled overhead, shattering the blackness with fiery artillery. After a while, she heard her sister downstairs in the kitchen, and because sleep would not come, she went down for a cup of tea. They talked until midnight when was still again, and the sound of firefighters died away. Explosions had ripped nearby, but now all was quiet. Stumbling through the darkness to her room, Miss ten Boom reached out to pat her pillow before lying down. Suddenly, she felt something sharp cutting her hand. It was a jagged piece of metal 10 inches long. She cried out for her sister and raced down the stairs with the shrapnel shard in her hand. While Betsy bandaged her hand, she kept saying, "Oh, your pillow?" Corrie responded, "Betsy, if I hadn't heard you in the kitchen..." Guess what? To this, the saintly sister replied, "Don't even say it, Corrie." There are no ifs in God's world. The center of His will is our safety. Later, through the trying time in a Nazi prison, Miss ten Boom was to learn over and over this marvelous truth: God's will is our hiding place. In other words, what Corrie was saying here was that being in the will of God is a place of safety and security. In our lesson today, we read that Naomi is concerned about the welfare of Ruth. Naomi is interested in finding a place of security for Ruth. Naomi's desire for Ruth was to find a place where she would be happy for the rest of her life. And I think, isn't that what most of us want in life? I mean, we know that life is difficult. We know that we have hardships. Like the song says, we go through many trials and stuff like that, but we still have to try to smile through it. But it's difficult. But we all want to find some place to be happy at, right? When Naomi and Ruth first came back to Bethlehem, Naomi was faced with three issues. First, how could the name of Elimelech be maintained among the tribes of Israel since both of her sons and her husband were dead?
You need to ask Ozella to turn her microphone off. It's resounding on it.
Okay. Ozella, can you turn your microphone off, please?
Pardon?
Can you turn your microphone off, please? Thank you. Second, what steps should be taken to protect her inheritance, which Elimelech had left in Naomi's trust? And third, how could she provide rest and security for her faithful daughter-in-law? Well, in our lesson today, we read that Naomi devises and discloses a plan for Ruth. We read in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but do not let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Now, again, I want to unpackage these 3 or 6 verses, because there's quite a bit in here that I want to cover. So, in chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, we read that Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished. According to verse 23 of the chapter 2, Ruth worked in the harvest field until the close of the barley and wheat harvest. In other words, she had worked in the field until the job was completely done. As we look over these verses, we are reminded that we as Christians are to stay working in the harvest field until our job is complete. In other words, we are to be out there working, inviting people to come to know Jesus Christ. Our job is not done until our life is over with as Christians. That's the job we've been assigned to do. And as we study the book of Ruth, I am also reminded that God is in control of all things, and that His timing in our lives is what matters. Right? Now, if you remember in our study of the book of Ruth, when Naomi and Ruth returned from Moab, they arrived at Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. We read about that in chapter 22, or verse 22 of chapter 1. Now, one commentary puts it this way: beginning of the harvest, or barley harvest, is a time phrase indicating that Naomi and Ruth arrived in the springtime, because barley was the first grain to be harvested in either March or April, while wheat was the last to be harvested. Springtime was the perfect time for 2 downtrodden widows to arrive. Flowers blooming on the Bethlehem hillside, new life becoming manifest after a long barren winter when everything dies, and the time of celebration of the feast of unleavened bread and the feast of the first fruits. Again, when you look at these passages and you dig into what's happening here, you realize that everything is in God's time frame. God had opened Naomi's eyes and realized that the famine was lifted in Bethlehem, and she decided to come back to Bethlehem. But the timing was right. It was right during this feast of unleavened bread whenever they showed up. Most of us know a little bit about our Old Testament festivals, don't we? But you can read about all of the festivals in Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus records the institutions of these 2 festivals, and we read that in Leviticus chapter 23 in verses 10 and 11. When you enter the land I am going to give you and reap its harvest, bring the priest a sheaf of the first grain of your harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. As you remember, at the close of chapter 1, we see that they arrived at just the right time during this harvest time. And again, what that symbolizes is that there are more to come, more people to come, more product to come. During March and April, some barley would be ready for harvest, and it would be plucked and bound together and weighed before the Lord on the day after the Sabbath. The very word first fruit means, or in essence, that there is more to come. In other words, this is a picture of more souls coming to Jesus Christ, or to God, to understanding. It appears that Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem just as the feast of unleavened bread was beginning. In other words, God knew what He was doing when He brought them back. Of course, God is in control of everything. He was the one guiding and directing their lives, and the time was right for them to come back to Bethlehem. In chapter 2, we read that Ruth goes out into the field and begins her work in Boaz's field. She begins working in a field that just happened to be owned by a wealthy man named Boaz. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew that she needed to get out and find a way to make a living or to get food for her and Naomi. But she ends up in a field of Boaz. Now, for those that haven't been with us during this series, Boaz represents Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. And Ruth captures the attention of Boaz, and she finds favor in his sight. Boaz invites her to have a meal with him. Ruth returns back to work after the meal was done and continued working while Boaz works behind the scenes, making sure that everything was going well for her. And again, Boaz pictures Jesus Christ working behind the scenes on our behalf, making sure that things go well for us. Even though there are times it doesn't seem like it, God is working at His plan for your life and mine. I know we don't always understand that. And we always feel, sometimes we feel like, what's the point of going on? But there's a plan being worked out on your behalf, and it's for your good, believe it or not. According to chapter 2 and verse 23, Ruth worked until the harvest was complete or finished. In other words, it appears that Ruth worked in a field for approximately 7 weeks, right up to the time of the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. And this you have to dig into to see what's going on here. This festival is called the Feast of Weeks because it was celebrated 7 complete weeks or 50 days after the Passover. Again, pointing to one of God's holy days. And the festival is called the Feast of Harvest because it included the harvest of the latter grains. In the spiritual matters, the Feast of Weeks represents the end of the harvest season or the end of Christ's personal ministry on earth. And I think that's some pretty neat background to understand wherever you dig into the book of Ruth. Because it doesn't say it right out plainly, does it? You have to dig in to find out what's going on. Now in chapter 3 we read about the plan of Naomi. Verse 1 says, one day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Wow. I think all of us like to find a home where we're well provided for. Right? Yeah, I think so. Now, ever since Boaz came into Ruth's life, Naomi has been a different person. Her concern is no longer for herself and her grief for herself, but is for her care is for Ruth. Now in chapter 1 we saw that after Naomi had lived in Moab for 10 years, she had lost everything. She had lost her family. She had lost her way of income. She had no way of providing for herself. She was destitute. When she came back to Bethlehem, she claimed that she came back empty-handed. She had nothing. And when she was away to Moab, or in Moab, had 2 husbands, one husband, 2 sons, property, possessions, she had it all. But then, after that long a time being in the land of Moab, she lost it all. And we read that when Naomi came back to Bethlehem, she was bitter because she had lost everything. And everything that meant anything in her life, it was gone. And we get the impression that she's ready to just give up and just end her life. I mean, we have people like that living like that today that want to give up on life. And unfortunately, some people end it.